He walked away from the most powerful throne on earth, and he never looked back. This is a story about a king who had everything and decided it wasn't enough. How did West African gold get to the Caribbean 200 years before the Europeans arrived? The prophet told us that seeking knowledge is a duty for every single one of us. But what if that search takes you to a place the rest of the world doesn't even know exists? While Europe was in the Dark Ages, Muslim explorers were already a bridge across the world. 2,000 ships, that's an armada. That's a floating city, driven not by greed, but by deep sense that Allah's creation is in your backyard and you have a responsibility to see it.
He walked away from the most powerful throne on earth, and he never looked back. Hit like and say Subhanallah right now before Shaitan takes you somewhere else. This is a story about a king who had everything: gold, soldiers, a kingdom that stretched further than the eye could see, and decided it wasn't enough. In the year 1312, the Emperor of Mali, Mansa Abu Bakr II, did something that sounds impossible. He didn't just send an explorer, he didn't just send a spy, he took 2,000 ships, filled them with the best minds, the bravest sailors, and enough food for 2 years, and he sailed into the Atlantic Ocean. He told his people, "I will not return until I reach the end of the ocean, or I die trying." The Prophet told us that seeking knowledge is a duty for every single one of us. But what if that search takes you to a place the rest of the world doesn't even know exists? The history books we read in school tell us the New World was discovered in 1492 by a man named Columbus. But there's a problem. When Columbus arrived, he wrote in his own journals about seeing black traders from the southeast. He wrote about finding gold-tipped spears that were identical to the ones used in West Africa. He found guanine, a specific gold alloy that the people of Mali were famous for making. How did West African gold get to the Caribbean 200 years before the Europeans arrived? The Prophet said, "Travel through the earth and see." But he didn't just mean go for a vacation, he meant find the truth. And the truth is, while Europe was in the Dark Ages, Muslim explorers might have already been building a bridge across the world. Imagine it for a second. 2,000 ships. That's an armada. That's a floating city. They weren't looking for slaves. They weren't looking for land to steal. They were looking for the edges of the world. They were driven by taqwa, that deep sense that Allah's creation is bigger than your backyard, and you have a responsibility to see it. But here is where it gets strange. Abu Bakr II didn't send a letter back. He didn't send a messenger. He just vanished. The most powerful man in Africa disappeared into the blue. His brother, the famous Mansa Musa, the man who would later crash the economy of Egypt just by giving away gold, was the one who told this story to the world. He said his brother was obsessed with what lay beyond the horizon. Was he crazy, or did he find exactly what he was looking for? Imagine the first time a Muslim sailor stepped onto the shores of what we now call Brazil or Mexico. No guns, no crosses, just a man who prays 5 times a day, standing on a beach he doesn't have a name for. What happens to a culture when its first contact with the old world isn't a conqueror, but a traveler? What happens to the first foreign words the indigenous people hear aren't demands for gold, but the adhan, the call to prayer echoing across a jungle that has never heard the name of Allah? This isn't just a what-if story. This is a what really happened mystery that has been buried under 500 years of colonial history. We've been told for centuries that the Americas were a blank slate waiting for Europe to arrive. But the evidence, the linguistic links, the botanical trades, the gold samples, tells a different story. It tells a story of a missed connection. If you stopped this video right now, you'd think this was just about ships and gold. But the real question isn't whether they landed. The real question is, what did they leave behind? And why don't we talk about it? Allah doesn't look at your history. He looks at your direction. Right now, which way is our history moving? Are we moving towards the truth, or are we just repeating the stories we were told to believe? Comment, tell me, if you want to know what the evidence actually says about the Muslim presence in the Americas before 1492. Stay with me, because the next part isn't about ships anymore. It's about a secret hidden in the languages of the native people that the history books are terrified to explain.
There is a secret to this story hidden in the maps. I'm going to prove to you that the history you were taught is incomplete, but only if you stay until the end. Most people who hear about Mansa Abu Bakr think it's just a legend, a myth from a campfire in Mali. I'll give you the specific detail from a 10th century geographer named Al-Masudi that changes everything. Subhanallah, if you're still with me. This next part is where most videos stop. We're going deeper. We are moving from the what happened to the why it matters right now. Because here is the setup. Before the year 1492, the world was a very different place. Europe was small, it was disconnected, but the Islamic world, it was an information superhighway. From the edge of Indonesia to the coast of Senegal, everyone was speaking the same language, using the same currency, and praying toward the same point. Imagine you are a sailor in the Mali Empire. You aren't just a fisherman, you are part of the wealthiest civilization in human history. Your king has so much gold that when he travels, the price of gold drops in every city he visits. You have the best astronomers, the best shipbuilders, and the most important thing of all, you have the Qibla, the direction. In Islam, we are obsessed with direction. We have to know where Mecca is, no matter where we are on the planet. This isn't just a religious rule, it's a scientific engine. To find Mecca from West Africa, you had to master the stars. You had to understand the curve of the earth. You had to know that the world wasn't flat, because you can't calculate a prayer direction on a flat map of a round world. So when Mansa Abu Bakr looked at the Atlantic, he didn't see a green sea of darkness like the Europeans did. He saw a road. The evidence we chose to ignore. Here is the Sunday school version of history. Columbus sailed the ocean blue, found a new world, and everyone lived happily ever after, except for the millions of people who were already there. But here is what's missing. When the first Spanish explorers entered Central America, they found something they couldn't explain. They found people wearing cotton garments that were woven exactly like the ones in West Africa. They found words in the native languages, Mandinka words that described things like trade, gold, and God. Wait, why would a person in ancient Mexico use a word that sounds like guanin to describe gold? Guanin is a Mandinka word from the Mali Empire. It's not a coincidence, it's a fingerprint. And then there are the maps. There is a famous map called the Piri Reis map, drawn by an Ottoman admiral. It shows the coastline of the Americas with incredible detail, decades before Europeans had even explored those areas. Where did he get that data? He said he got it from ancient charts. Whose charts? If you look at the currents of the Atlantic Ocean, there is a natural conveyor belt. It starts right off the coast of West Africa and pulls anything that floats directly toward the Caribbean and Brazil. If you put a boat in the water in Senegal and just wait, the ocean itself will take you to America.
The people of Mali knew this. They weren't just guessing, they were scientists. But here is the what if that changes your life today. If Mansa Abu Bakr's fleet landed in 1312, they arrived 180 years before the first slave ship. They arrived as traders, they arrived as neighbors. Imagine a world where the first Old World influence in America was a culture that believed in zakat, the duty to give away your wealth to the poor. Imagine a culture that believed in Tawheed, the oneness of God, meeting a culture that saw the divine in the sun and the trees. There would have been a conversation, not a conquest, a trade of ideas. But wait, you might say, if they landed, why isn't there a giant mosque in New York City from the 1300s? That's the mystery we're going to solve in Act 6. But before we get there, we have to look at the world they built. We have to see the atmosphere of this Islamic America. Before we go further, hit subscribe. You'll understand why in 30 minutes. Because what we are about to describe is a version of history that was erased on purpose. And when you see why it was erased, you will never look at a map the same way. The scholars say there is a detail in the burial mounds of the Mississippi Valley that matches the burial rites of the Sahel. We're going to look at that next. And that's when it gets strange. Imagine stepping off a wooden deck after 4 months of seeing nothing but the infinite blue of the Atlantic. Your boots sink into sand that is whiter than the salt in the markets of Timbuktu. The air here doesn't have the dry, stinging heat of the Sahel. It smells like damp earth, crushed hibiscus, and a heavy, sweet spice you've never tasted in your life. You are 4,000 miles from home. You are a sailor of the Mali Empire, and you are standing on a shore that doesn't exist on any map in the Royal Library. The silence is the first thing that hits you. In the cities of the Niger River, the wind always carries a sound, the clinking of camel bells, the shouting of traders, or the call to prayer echoing from the mud brick minarets. Here, the only sound is the rhythmic thrum of the jungle. You hear insects the size of your fist, birds with feathers that look like liquid emeralds, and the heavy, humid breath of trees that seem to touch the clouds. This is the world of the forgotten voyage. But you aren't alone. From the edge of the tree line, eyes are watching. These aren't the eyes of enemies. They are the eyes of the Taino, the Olmec, the people who have lived in harmony with this land for thousands of years. They see men with skin like polished ebony, wearing robes of fine cotton and turbans that gleam like silver in the tropical sun. They see ships larger than any canoe they've ever carved from a cedar trunk. There is no clash of civilizations here, not yet. There is only a profound, heavy curiosity. One of the sailors kneels. He isn't bowing to a king or a conqueror. He is pressing his forehead to the sand because it is the time of Dhuhr, the noon prayer. He doesn't know the name of this beach, but he knows where Mecca is. He has used his astrolabe to track the sun and the stars with the precision of a clockmaker. Even at the edge of the world, he is a needle pointing home. The local people approach slowly. They bring gifts of cassava and sweet potatoes. The sailors offer salt and guanin, that specific African gold alloy that will one day baffle European archaeologists. They share a meal. The taste is a shock, the sharp sting of chili peppers and the cool sweetness of pineapple. For the first time in human history, the flavors of the Niger River and the Amazon are sitting on the same tongue. In the Islamic tradition, there is a concept called rihla, the journey for knowledge. It's the idea that travel is a form of worship because it humbles you. It shows you how small you are and how vast the Creator's imagination truly is. These sailors weren't looking for slaves or land to steal. They were generalists, men who were warriors, navigators, and poets all at once. They believed that everywhere they walked, they were walking on Allah's carpet. They didn't plant a flag to say this belongs to Mali. they built a small, simple structure of stone and wood. It wasn't a palace, it was a musalla, a simple place of prayer. The indigenous people watch as these strangers wash their hands and faces with water before they speak to the unseen. They see a culture that doesn't worship the stars, but uses the stars as a map to find the divine. A non-Muslim standing there in 1312 wouldn't feel threatened. They would feel a sense of wonder. They would see two groups of humans who have never met finding common ground in the most basic things: the need for food, the love of family, and the awe of the night sky. But what happened next, I almost didn't include this. Most people who know the story of Mansa Abu Bakr have never heard this version. Wait, before we go further, the scholars say something about this moment that changes what you just heard. There is a detailed account in the writings of a 14th century scholar named Al-Omeri. He interviewed the people who stayed behind in Mali. He asked them why only one ship ever returned from the first expedition. The captain of that lone ship told a terrifying story. He said they reached a river in the middle of the ocean, a massive, roaring current that swallowed the other ships like a giant's throat. He was paralyzed by fear, so he turned back. But Mansa Abu Bakr didn't feel terror. He felt a calling. He didn't believe his men were dead. He believed they had found the doorway to the other side. That is why he took 2,000 ships the second time. He wasn't looking for a return ticket. He was looking for a new beginning. Imagine the atmosphere on those ships during that final voyage, the sound of the Quran being recited over the roar of the Atlantic waves, the smell of dried fish and old cedar wood, the feeling of being completely untethered from everything you once knew. If you were on that ship, would you feel afraid, or would you feel the peace of tawakkul, that total reliance on Allah that comes only when you realize you have zero control over the waves? The atmosphere of the Islamic Americas was one of wood and spirit. It was a world where a call to prayer could be heard mixing with the sounds of the jungle, and for a few beautiful decades, the world felt whole. But every world faces a crisis, and the collision that was coming would change the DNA of the entire planet.
Every story has a moment where the lights go out. For the fleet of Mali, this is the dark valley. It's the space between the grand ambition of a king and the cold reality of the earth. We love the parts of history that involve gold and discovery, but we rarely talk about the cost. We rarely talk about the silence. The cost of Mansa Abu Bakr's voyage wasn't just the ships, it was the total erasure of an empire's presence in a new world. Think about your own life for a second, not his, yours. Have you ever given everything to a project, a relationship, or a dream, only for it to leave no trace? That feeling of doing something massive and having the world act like it never happened, that is the Dark Valley. When the Malians integrated into the Americas, they didn't just live happily ever after. They faced the ultimate sacrifice, the loss of their identity. To survive among the Olmec or the Maya, they couldn't remain Malians. They had to become part of the local soil. They had to watch as their children began to speak different languages. They had to watch as the specific memory of the Niger River faded into a legend of men who came from the rising sun. The cost of silence. The Dark Valley principle is simple. Greatness often requires you to become invisible. Mansa Abu Bakr took the wealthiest throne on the planet and traded it for a wooden deck and a horizon that never ended. He lost his status. He lost his comfort. He lost the ability to ever be buried in the royal tombs of his ancestors. He died in a land that didn't know his title. And for the people who stayed in Mali, the cost was a hole in their history. Mansa Musa, the younger brother, took the throne. He became the richest man in history, but he always lived in the shadow of the brother who left.
When he went on his famous Hajj to Mecca, he spoke of the story of his brother to the scholars in Cairo. He spoke of him with a mixture of pride and grief. He was describing a ghost. But the real Dark Valley happened 180 years later. In 1492, the winds of the Atlantic changed. The ships that came next weren't looking for a rihla or a journey of knowledge. They came with steel, with germs, and with a mandate to own everything they touched. This is the moment the Islamic Americas was truly buried. When the Spanish conquistadors arrived, they didn't just conquer the land, they conquered the memory. They burned the libraries of the Aztecs. They destroyed the records of the Maya. Any evidence that someone else, especially someone from the Islamic world, had been there first was a threat to their discovery. Imagine being a descendant of those Malian sailors living in a village in the Caribbean, watching as these new ships arrived. You have the stories of your grandfathers. You have the Gowanin gold they brought. You might even still have a few Arabic words left in your prayers. And then you watch as it is all systematically deleted. The Dark Valley is the moment you realize that history isn't written by the people who were there. It's written by the people who survived with the loudest voices. The human mirror. When was the last time you kept going, even when you didn't know if it was working? That is the weight the Malians carried for generations. They kept their values, they kept their sense of a single creator, but they lost their name. They became the Black Indians, the Moorish traders, the strange travelers in the footnotes of Spanish journals. The scholars say this is the part, right here, that most people never wait for. What happens in the space between the attempt and the answer? In Islam, we are taught that no effort is ever truly lost. Allah is Al-Basir, the all-seeing. Even if every book is burned and every monument is knocked down, the action itself is recorded in a book that cannot be destroyed. The Malians paid the ultimate price. They gave up their place in the history books so they could fulfill their destiny as travelers. They were the strangers the prophet spoke of. They existed in a world that didn't recognize them. They practiced a faith that had no masjid. They held on to a truth that had no support system. And this is the part that took me 3 days to understand when I first read it. The scholars agree on what comes next, but they disagree why. Some say the Malians failed because they didn't leave a lasting empire. Others say they succeeded because they didn't leave an empire. They left something much more resilient, a DNA of resistance and a memory of a God who is one. The Dark Valley isn't a dead end, it's a tunnel, and as we move into Act 6, we are going to see the light at the end of that tunnel. We are going to see the aha moment that was promised at the very beginning. Because what happened to that Gowanin gold? What happened to those Arabic inscriptions in the desert? They didn't just disappear. They were waiting for us to find them in 2026. Type "I'm here" if you're still watching, because what we find in the next act changes everything you think you know about who you are.
Remember at the beginning when I said there's one detail most translations cut out? One specific piece of the puzzle that makes this story feel like physics, not poetry. Here it is. When Mansa Musa arrived in Cairo in 1324, he sat with the Egyptian scholar Al-Umari. He told the story of his brother Abu Bakr and the 2,000 ships. For centuries, Western historians dismissed this as African folklore. They called it a tall tale from a king who wanted to sound impressive. But then the science started to catch up. The linguistic fingerprint. The word in Arabic is Amir, a leader or commander. But in the Mandinka language of the Mali Empire, it evolved. In the 1300s, the Malians had a specific word for the gold they traded, guanin. When Columbus reached the Caribbean, he didn't just find gold, he found an alloy. He took samples back to Spain and had them tested by royal goldsmiths. The result? The gold from the New World was an identical match to the gold being minted in West Africa. It had the exact same ratio of gold, silver, and copper. But that's not the twist. The twist is the name. The native peoples in the Caribbean called this gold guanine, the exact same word, the exact same alloy, the exact same ratio. Now, look at the sequence again. First, Abu Bakr sails with 2,000 ships, then he vanishes, then 180 years later, Europeans find his currency, his metallurgy, and his vocabulary being used by people who have supposedly never met an African. Most people think history is a series of accidents, but this word tells us something different. It tells us that the Malians didn't just land and die, they integrated. They taught the indigenous people how to refine metal. They traded, they spoke. Allah wasn't waiting for the discovery in 1492. He had already moved the pieces across the board centuries before. The cosmic scale. Why it was hidden. Why does this matter to you right now? Because it reveals a law of the universe. Truth doesn't need a flag to be real. We are obsessed with who gets the credit. We want the monument, we want the Wikipedia page, but the Malians practiced a level of ikhlas, sincerity, that we can barely imagine. They brought the light of Tawheed, the oneness of God, to a new continent, and then they allowed their names to be swallowed by the jungle. They didn't build a Mali 2.0, they built a bridge. Look at the maps again. If you follow the currents from the coast of Guinea, they lead you directly to the Gulf of Mexico. If you look at the ancient stone carvings of the Olmec civilization, which predates the Aztecs, you see faces with features that are unmistakably West African. You see helmets that look exactly like the leather battle gear of the Mali cavalry. The hidden truth is that the world has always been smaller than the colonizers want you to believe. They want you to believe that Islam was brought to the West by immigrants in the 1900s. They want you to believe you are a guest in a land that was discovered by someone else. But the linguistic reveal tells us a different story. It says you were here when the foundations were being laid. It says the adhan was whispered in the Caribbean breeze while Europe was still burning books. So here is what Islamic logic actually says about this. In the Quran, Allah says, "We have sent to every nation a messenger." If Mansa Abu Bakr reached the Americas, he wasn't just a king on a boat, he was a carrier of a message. He was part of a cosmic plan to ensure that no corner of the earth was left without the mention of the Creator. The twist isn't that they found America, the twist is that they became America. They intermarried, they shared their stories of the prophets, they shared their knowledge of the stars, and when the Spanish arrived to erase everything, the Malians didn't fight for a throne, they had already given that up in Senegal. They fought for the soul of the people. That is why today you find Moorish architecture in the oldest parts of Mexico. That is why you find Arabic roots in the names of mountains in the Andes. That is why the Black Christ of Esquipulas exists in Central America, a dark-skinned figure of devotion that predates the European version of Christianity in the region. Look at the sequence of history again through this new lens. It wasn't a failed voyage, it was a successful mission of Ghuraba, the strangers. They arrived, they planted, and they faded away, leaving the fruit for someone else to find. And this is where it stops being about them, because what I'm about to say next, this is about you. The last part, the part I almost ended the video before. Stay for 2 more minutes because the real revelation isn't in a 700-year-old map, it's in the mirror. Type "I'm here" if you're still watching, because what comes next is for you specifically.
Right now, as you watch this, your own record is being written, not his, yours. The same unseen system that was watching Mansa Abu Bakr as he stood on the deck of a ship in 1312, looking at a horizon that shouldn't exist. That system is watching you right now, in this exact moment. We've spent an hour talking about a king who left everything behind. We've talked about ships and gold and ancient maps and the river in the sea. But this video was never really about the history of the Americas. It was always about you. The question at the center of this story is simple. What are you willing to lose to find what is true? Mansa Abu Bakr had the most powerful throne on earth. He had more gold than any man who has ever lived, and he walked away from it. Why? Because his heart told him there was more to Allah's creation than the walls of his palace. He chose the unknown because he trusted the known. He trusted the Creator. Are you still standing in the same place you were a year ago? What's the one thing you know you need to do but haven't started yet because you're afraid of the ocean? Your heart knows the direction. The question is, are you moving? The Malians who landed in the Americas didn't leave a monument with their names on it. They didn't care about the credit. They cared about the mission. They integrated, they served, and they disappeared. They practiced a level of sincerity that makes our modern world, where we post every good deed for likes, look small. If you're watching this alone right now, pause wherever you are. Close your eyes for 5 seconds. Don't ask me why, just do it. Because somewhere in that silence, something is waiting for you to decide your next move. The same angels who were watching those 2,000 ships, recording every prayer whispered over the Atlantic waves, they're recording right now. They're waiting to see what you do in the next 10 minutes. Will you go back to scrolling, or will you realize that you are the descendant of a legacy that doesn't believe in impossible? You are not a guest in this world. You are a traveler. Your identity isn't a label given to you by a history book. It's a map written in your DNA. Type Astaghfirullah in the comments right now. Not for me, not for the algorithm, for your own soul to see it written, acknowledging that we've all been standing still for too long and it's time to move. Subscribe so you don't miss what I'm dropping next. It's going to hit even harder than this one. Share this with one person who thinks they're too far gone, someone who feels like their story is over, someone who thinks they've lost too much. Don't pick carefully. Your gut already knows who it is.